Welcome. The following presentation was designed to accompany the introduction of the high school assessment document. This session will cover the differences between formative and summative assessment, introduce some of the high school assessment and evaluation guiding practices while integrating research that tells us whether a given practice or strategy has a positive impact on student learning. Let's begin with a question. What makes good instruction and how do we know? John Hattie's research on effect size helps us understand the impact of a given instructional strategy, idea, or tool in more measurable terms. It lets us know how powerful a given influence is in changing achievement or how much bang you get for your buck. Through meta-analysis, Hattie was able to determine that influences, strategies, actions, and so on with an effect size of more than 0.40 allows students to learn at an appropriate rate, a rate of a year of growth for a year in school. The protractor graphic shows effect sizes ranging from negative 0.2 to 1.2. Yes, it is possible for an instructional strategy to have a negative effect size. As you see by where the arrow points, the effect size of formative assessment is well within the zone of desired effects and has a high effect size. So, what exactly is formative assessment and how does it differ from summative assessment? Formative assessment is about gathering real-time data about where students are in the learning process. When used regularly and embedded in curriculum and teaching activities, it improves student achievement. Referred to as assessment for learning, we are talking about assessment for which the first priority in its design and practice is to serve the purpose of promoting student learning. It thus differs from assessment designed primarily to serve the purposes of accountability or ranking or of certifying competency. This graphic shows the role of teachers, peers, and students at three different phases of the learning process: where the learner is going, where the learner is now, and how to get the learner there. A copy of this graphic is available in the ProSchool course. Summative assessment, on the other hand, has an entirely different purpose than formative assessment. The goal of summative assessment is to evaluate student learning at the end of a learning cycle by comparing it against some standard or benchmark. Examples of summative assessment could include a final exam or project. It's time for an activity. Let's use a simple but powerful formative assessment strategy that not only solidifies learning but also helps to monitor student understanding. An analogy is a comparison in which an idea or concept is compared to another concept that is quite different from it. It aims at explaining the idea or something by comparing it to something that is familiar. Metaphors and similes are used to draw an analogy. After the next slide, pause the video in order to give this formative assessment strategy a try. Work with a partner to develop your own formative versus summative assessment analogy. See how many you can come up with and be ready to share your favorite analogy. Here's an example for you. Formative assessment is when the chef tastes the soup. Summative assessment is when the guests taste the soup. Another example might be, formative assessment is like practice, while summative assessment is like the big game. Okay, it's your turn. Make an analogy. Formative assessment is like blank, while summative assessment is like blank. Please share your analogies with your group, and if you wish, tweet them to @evanduzen. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed the analogy exercise. Let's take another look at more of John Hattie's work. Clearly communicating the intentions of lessons, along with criteria for success, has a high effect size. Hattie describes this in terms of teacher clarity. Teacher clarity is closely related to the first assessment and evaluation guiding practice. That is, that curriculum must be meaningful, coherent, and relevant. Part of this principle is to ensure alignment between intended learning outcomes, assessment techniques, and learning experiences. Teachers work together to address clear purpose, clear learning goals, and sound design. What is a good example of a strategic action that can be used around teacher clarity to clarify and share learning intentions and success criteria with learners? This can involve the unpacking of an outcome to provide learning goals for each lesson, to establish goals for focused learning. Learning intentions make what is expected clear to students and help both the student and teacher determine how successful the learning has been. This template can be used as a planning framework based on provincial learning outcomes and should be openly designed with and shared with students. Success criteria help students and teachers determine how successful the learning has been, and it helps describe current performance accurately. It describes what success looks like and when the learning goal is reached. It is specific, concrete, and measurable. To make success criteria even more clear, the development and use of rubrics is highly encouraged in good assessment practice. One of the most rewarding and effective ways to develop rubrics is through collaboration with peers. At the high school level, it would be logical to work in cores to do so. Hattie found that classroom discussion has an effect size of 0.82. There are certain characteristics of a rich classroom discourse that lead to student understanding and confidence. One, that it supports students in building understanding based on previous knowledge and making connections. Also, that it values mistakes and sees them as opportunities for students to clarify their thinking. It also helps students to consider different approaches and opinions. And lastly, it allows a teacher to assess student knowledge through the discussion. Using classroom discussion as an instructional strategy is closely related to guiding practice number 3, which speaks directly to classroom discussions. Regarding effective classroom discussions, students need to be drenched in accountable talk. Accountable talk is an approach framing discourse practice of students. Accountable talk should flood the classroom. ProSchool contains a handout with ideas for implementing accountable talk. Feedback scored an effect size of 0.75. The feedback that students receive from their teachers is important because it enables students to progress towards challenging learning intentions and goals. Feedback on tasks, process, and self-regulation level is far more effective than on the self level. So, for an example, praise, which contains no learning information. Feedback appears in the assessment and evaluation guiding practices as practice number 9. Teachers provide feedback to students every day. The most important thing about feedback is what students do with it. Refer to the feedback that fosters learning video in the ProSchool course. Navigate the video timeline to 2 minutes and 19 seconds to see how a teacher is using feedback in her secondary classroom. With an effect size of 1.44, student expectations. Teachers know whether or not their students are learning what they're supposed to, but students need to know whether they're on the right track as well. Self-assessment and self-reported grades engage students in monitoring their learning to determine the extent to which students can describe their current performance accurately and whether or not the performance is high or low. Opportunities for self-assessment and self-grading has the highest influence on student success. This is most closely related to practice number 10, activating students as owners of their own learning. Ultimately, it is the learner who is in charge of their learning, and they need to know whether or not they're on the right track. Student involvement in assessment gives them responsibility for their own learning and fosters lifelong learners. Self-assessment and inclusive ownership will help all students take an active role and ownership of their learning. Developing rubrics and success criteria with students as co-constructors encourages them to take ownership of their learning. Students can also be instructional resources for one another. This strategy is related to both feedback and classroom discourse. Responsible collaboration among students results in students learning from one another, and the idea that students are often more willing to accept feedback from a peer. Lastly, as a bonus, we look at the value of teacher-student relationships. Nobody would argue with the idea that teacher-student relationships are important. They do have a strong effect size. This effect size is included because often teacher-student relationships are thought of as something separate from assessment and instruction. Formative assessment strategies allow teachers to have honest and respectful relationships with students. So go ahead and take the time to develop meaningful relationships with your students through sound assessment pedagogy. It is hoped that this session helped you to further understand the difference between formative and summative assessments, and also introduced you to Hattie's valuable research findings in relation to the assessment and evaluation guiding practices. Of course, this session introduced only 4 of the 10 assessment and evaluation guiding practices. These 4 practices, along with the other 6, will be more closely explored throughout the school year.